I still remember the exact moment I understood that my mind was being harvested. Not taught, not mentored, harvested. Like a field that someone else owned, that someone else tended, that someone else reaped while I stood at the edge watching the grain become bread I would never taste. I was 22, sitting in a seminar room with windows that looked out at a winter sky the color of old ash, and Dr. Catherine Marsh was reading my essay aloud to a room full of graduate students who did not know my name. She was reading it as an example of promising but underdeveloped undergraduate work, and then she was reading her own response to it, a response that was, paragraph by paragraph, my essay rewritten in her voice, my argument dressed in her vocabulary, my discovery of the Japanese theater concept of ma reframed as her original contribution to the theory of performativity. She did not look at me while she read. She did not need to. I was not a person in that room. I was a raw material. I was a footnote waiting to happen. Welcome to Little Bunny Stories. If you are new here, my name is Lena, and what I am about to tell you is a story about the professor who graded my silence, who measured my intelligence by how quietly I accepted her theft, who built a career on the minds of women she promised to lift up and instead buried under her own name. If you have ever had an idea so good that someone with power decided to take it, stay with me. Hit that subscribe button, turn on your notifications, and listen until the end. Because this story does not end with tenure. It ends with a conference room, a projector, and the sound of 8 women reading words that were always ours. Here is my story. I was 19 when I entered Catherine Marsh's orbit. She was 50 then, already a legend, the kind of academic whose name appeared on syllabi before students knew what the syllabi meant. She had written the book on performativity, literally, a text called The Staged Self that was required reading in every gender studies program in the country. She had founded a journal, chaired a department, spoken at conferences where younger scholars queued for hours to ask questions. She would answer with the weary patience of someone who had already thought everything worth thinking. I was not supposed to be in her graduate seminar. I was an undergraduate, a junior, but I had written a paper on Judith Butler that her teaching assistant had shown her, and she had invited me to audit the course. I wept when I received the email. I printed it. I pinned it to the wall above my desk in the apartment I shared with 2 roommates, both of whom were studying business and did not know who Judith Butler was. I told myself that this was the beginning, that Catherine Marsh had seen something in me, that she was going to be the mentor who would lift me from obscurity into the light of serious scholarship. I was half right. She saw something in me. She saw a mind that worked faster than hers, that made connections she had not made, that saw the gaps in her own theory and filled them with ideas she had not imagined. She saw a resource, and she began to harvest. The first theft was small. A paper I wrote on drag performance as political resistance, which she returned with a B and a note that said interesting but underdeveloped. 3 months later, I read an article in her journal with the same argument, the same examples, the same theoretical framework. She had added citations to Butler and Austin and Goffman, but the architecture was mine. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself that ideas circulate, that influence is not theft, that great minds think alike and lesser minds, minds like mine, should be grateful to think alike with greatness. The second theft was larger. My senior thesis, 100 pages on the concept of ma in Japanese theater, and its application to Western theories of gender performance. I had spent a year learning Japanese to read the original sources. I had spent my savings on a trip to Tokyo to interview no performers. I had stayed up nights, in my unheated apartment, writing and rewriting, trying to capture something that I could feel but not yet name. A silence between gestures that was not emptiness but meaning. A space that was not absence but presence in another form. Catherine read the thesis. She called it promising. She called it a foundation that needed her guidance to become truly significant. She asked me to stay on as her research assistant after graduation, to develop the ideas further, to work with her on what she was now calling her next major project. I said yes. I was 22. I was hungry. I believed that collaboration was the price of entry, that my name would appear eventually, that the work mattered more than the credit. For 3 years I worked for her. I wrote her lectures. I drafted her articles. I developed her arguments. I sat in her office while she read my work aloud, changed a word here and there, and sent it to publishers with her name alone on the byline. When I asked about co-authorship, She said the academy was not ready to take me seriously yet. When I asked about acknowledgement, she said footnotes were the currency of young scholars, and I should be grateful to appear in them. When I asked about my own dissertation, she said I was not ready, that my ideas were still too raw, that I needed more time in her shadow to learn the discipline of serious thought. I was 25 when I found the courage to leave, not to confront her. I was not brave enough for that, just to leave. I applied to other programs. I asked other professors for recommendations. And Catherine, who had built her empire on the silence of women like me, responded with the precision of someone who had done this before. She wrote to the programs I had applied to. She did not accuse me of plagiarism, not directly. She suggested that my work showed inconsistencies, that my data might need verification, that she had concerns about my academic integrity that she felt obligated to share as a matter of professional responsibility. She did not need to say more. The academy is a small town, and Catherine Marsh was its mayor. My applications disappeared. My recommendations evaporated. My name became a whisper in hallways, a cautionary tale about the student who had been given everything and had somehow failed to be grateful. I left anyway. I left with no degree, no prospects, no proof that I had ever been anything but a failed graduate student with delusions of originality. I moved to a city where no one knew Catherine's name. I found work as a technical editor, correcting the grammar of engineers who did not care who Judith Butler was. I married a man who loved me for my silence, who found my academic ambitions embarrassing, who told me that the world of theory was a world of pretension and that I was better off without it. I believed him. I believed everyone. I buried my mind under layers of survival and told myself that ideas were luxuries I could no longer afford. For 15 years, I lived in that burial. I edited manuals. I raised 2 children who did not know that their mother had once written things that other people had found worth stealing. I watched from a distance as Catherine's star rose higher. She became dean. She became president of the National Association. She became the face of feminist scholarship, the woman who had mentored a generation, whose office door was always open, whose generosity was legendary. And I watched as my ideas, my silence between gestures, became the foundation of her later work. The book that won her the National Book Award. The lecture series that was broadcast on public television. The theory of performative silence that she presented at the United Nations, that was cited by politicians and poets. That became the framework for a generation of activists who did not know that the framework had been built by a 22-year-old girl in an unheated apartment who had been told she was not ready. I told myself I was over it. I told myself that the work mattered more than the credit, that ideas belonged to everyone, that Catherine had refined what I had only sketched, that her success was not my failure. I told myself these things until 6 months ago, when I received an email. It was from a former classmate, someone I had not thought about in years, someone who had been in Catherine's seminar the day she read my essay aloud. The email was brief. It contained a link to a conference program and a single sentence. She is receiving the Lifetime Achievement Award. The theory of performative silence will be the centerpiece. I thought you should know. I clicked the link. The conference was the largest international gathering of gender studies scholars, held every 3 years in a different city. This year, it was in Chicago, 2 hours from where I lived. Catherine was the keynote speaker. She was receiving an award for her contribution to the field, an award that came with a $100,000 honorarium and a permanent place in the canon. Her keynote was titled The Future of Feminist Scholarship, Mentoring the Next Generation. I read the abstract. It was my work, my words, my life rewritten as her generosity, her vision, her legacy of lifting up young women who would otherwise have been lost. I sat at my kitchen table, my children at school, my husband at work, and I felt something crack. Not the careful shell I had built around my anger, the anger itself. The cold, hard, 15-year-old anger that had never gone away, that had only been waiting for a reason to breathe. I was not going to let her have this. Not this award, not this speech. Not this final performance of a generosity that had never existed. I was going to give her the stage she wanted, and then I was going to take it apart, piece by piece, citation by citation, until the only thing left was the truth. But I could not do it alone. I knew that. Catherine had spent 40 years building walls, and I was one brick. I needed other bricks. I needed to find the other women she had buried. I started with the archives, Not academic archives, the personal kind. The internet forums where graduate students shared warnings about advisors to avoid. The whisper networks where women traded stories about the professors who stole their work and ruined their careers. I searched for Catherine's name and I found what I expected. A pattern, a methodology, a system. There was Maria, who had written a dissertation on performative grief that Catherine had turned into a book chapter without acknowledgement. There was Aisha, whose theory of embodied silence had appeared in Catherine's journal with Catherine as sole author. There was Yuki, whose work on no theater had been the original source for Catherine's Japanese examples, who had been dismissed from her program after Catherine suggested her research was fabricated. There was Priya, whose concept of intersectional performativity had become Catherine's most cited article. There was Sarah, whose dissertation on drag kings had been rejected by Catherine's committee and then published by Catherine 2 years later. There was Fatima, whose archival research on Middle Eastern performance traditions had been absorbed into Catherine's comparative work without a single footnote. There was Joe, whose statistical analysis of gender performance in social media had been presented by Catherine at a conference while Joe watched from the audience. 7 women, 7 minds, 7 lives diverted, diminished, disappeared into the footnotes of Catherine's empire. I contacted them, one by one. I told them who I was, I told them what I had found. I asked them if they were ready to be seen. 4 said yes immediately, 2 hesitated, then agreed. 1, Yuki, had died 3 years earlier of an overdose that her sister believed was not entirely accidental. I included her anyway. I found her dissertation in an archive, I had her sister's permission. Yuki would speak even if it was through my voice. We met in a borrowed apartment, the 7 of us, on a Saturday in March. We ranged in age from 34 to 52. We were teachers, editors, lawyers, activists, one unemployed philosopher. We had never met before, but we knew each other instantly. The way Catherine had smiled before she took. The way she had made us feel grateful for our own erasure. The way she had used the language of feminism to build a hierarchy that served only herself. We spent 3 months planning, not with lawyers, not with official complaints. The statute of limitations had expired on most of our grievances, and Catherine's institution had never found her responsible for anything. We planned with the tools she had taught us, ironically, without knowing she was teaching us. We planned with theory, with performativity, with the understanding that the most devastating exposure is not the one that accuses, but the one that simply shows. I infiltrated the conference as a volunteer. I used my married name, which Catherine had never known. I used my technical editing resume, which made me seem harmless, competent, invisible. I was assigned to the audiovisual team, the people who ran the projectors and microphones and live streams for the main hall. It was perfect. It gave me access to everything. The other 7 registered as attendees. They sat in different sections of the hall, scattered among the 500 delegates, indistinguishable from the crowd. We had rehearsed our parts. We knew exactly when to speak, what to read, how to project our voices without microphones. We were a chorus, trained to be silent, now finally ready to sing. The conference opened on a Thursday. Catherine's keynote was scheduled for Saturday evening, the final event, the culmination of 3 days of scholarship and celebration. She spent the first 2 days being honored, a reception in her name, a panel of her former students, all successful, all carefully chosen, all speaking about her transformative mentorship. A screening of a documentary about her career, funded by a foundation she had helped establish, narrated by a voice that described her as the mother of modern performativity theory. I watched it all from the control booth. I watched her smile, her gracious nods, her practiced humility. I watched her accept praise for ideas she had taken from women who were not in the room, who had never been invited to the room, who had been told that the room was not ready for them. I felt the old coldness, the old silence, the old space between gestures that was not emptiness but meaning waiting to be born. Saturday arrived. The hall was packed. 500 scholars, journalists, students, activists. The live stream was feeding to thousands more. The stage was set with flowers and a podium and a screen for the presentation. Catherine was wearing a burgundy suit, the color of authority without aggression, the color she had worn in every photograph that mattered. She was introduced by the current president of the association, a woman who had been Catherine's student, who spoke with tears in her eyes about the debt the field owed to its founder. Catherine took the podium. She smiled. She adjusted her glasses. She began to speak. The future of feminist scholarship, she said, depends on our willingness to mentor, to lift up voices that would otherwise be lost, to create space for the next generation, even when it means stepping back from our own spotlight. I pressed the first button. The screen behind her went dark. She paused, confused, still smiling the way Rosa had paused, the way all performers pause when the script changes without their knowledge. Then the screen lit up with a document, a scan page dated 15 years earlier, my senior thesis. The title page with my name, my date, my advisor's signature. The audience murmured. Catherine turned, saw the image, and her smile flickered. I pressed the second button. The screen showed a side-by-side comparison. A paragraph from my thesis and a paragraph from Catherine's article published 3 years later. The same argument, the same structure. The same sentence word for word with only my name removed and hers inserted. I stood up from the control booth. I walked down the stairs. I walked to the front of the hall and I began to read. I did not shout. I did not accuse. I simply read my own words, in my own voice, the words I had written at 22 in my unheated apartment, while Catherine slept in the house that my labor had helped pay for. The concept of ma, I read, is not merely a pause in performance. It is a space of potentiality, a silence that is not empty but full of meaning that has not yet been spoken. In Western theories of performativity, we have focused on the gesture, the word, the visible act. But Ma suggests that what is withheld, what is left unsaid, what is performed in the space between bodies, may be the most politically significant aspect of gendered existence. I looked up from my paper. I looked at Catherine. She was frozen at the podium, her hand still raised in the gesture of authority she had not yet completed. These are my words, I said. Written in 2008. Published by Dr. Catherine Marsh in 2011, without acknowledgement, without citation, without my knowledge or consent. They became the foundation of her theory of performative silence. They became the basis of her National Book Award. They became the framework that she will discuss tonight, in a speech about mentoring the next generation. I did not wait for her response. I looked at the audience, and I said, I am not the only one. Then Maria stood. She was in the third row, a woman of 40 with gray in her hair and a voice that shook only at the beginning. She read a paragraph from her dissertation on performative grief, and then she read the paragraph from Catherine's book where it had appeared, unchanged, unacknowledged, absorbed into the great mentor's corpus. Then Aisha stood. She read from her theory of embodied silence, and then from Catherine's journal article, the same theory, the same examples, the same argument, with Aisha's name nowhere to be found. Then Priya, then Sarah, then Fatima, then Joe. Each woman standing in her place reading her stolen words, building a chorus of evidence that filled the hall like music. The audience was silent at first, then restless, then openly weeping, then standing, some of them in solidarity, in recognition, in the delayed acknowledgement of what they were witnessing. Yuki spoke last. I spoke for her, reading from her dissertation, the work that had been dismissed as fabrication, the research that had been destroyed by Catherine's accusation. I read it with Yuki's sister in the audience, crying in the front row, hearing her sister's voice for the first time in a room that had never allowed her to speak. When I finished, the hall was silent. Not the silence of Ma, not the silence full of meaning, but the silence of a structure collapsing, of a narrative shattering, of a saint being unmade in real time. Catherine had not moved. She stood at the podium, her hand still raised, her face gray, her empire dissolving around her like mist. I walked to the center aisle. I turned to face her and I said the last words I would ever speak to her. You taught me that performativity is about what we do, not what we say. You were right. For 15 years I performed gratitude. I performed humility. I performed the good student who understood that her ideas were not yet ready for the world. Tonight I am performing something else. I am performing the truth. And the truth is that your entire career is a performance of my silence. I walked out of the hall. I did not wait for security. I did not wait for applause. I walked through the crowd, past the journalists who were already typing, past the students who were already filming, out into the October night. The fallout was immediate. Catherine's award was rescinded before midnight. Her presidency emerita was revoked within the week. 2 previous awards were withdrawn, their names removed from the official records. The university where she had taught for 30 years opened an investigation, not into her alone, but into the system that had protected her, the committees that had dismissed complaints, the colleagues who had looked away. She retired officially 6 months later. She did not die as Rosa had died, alone and unmourned. She had family, money, a life that would continue in diminished form. But her name, which had been synonymous with feminist scholarship, became synonymous with something else. The Marsh case, they called it, the systematic theft that had been hiding in plain sight, protected by the very ideology it claimed to serve. I did not return to academia. I was offered positions, fellowships, the restoration of a career that had been taken from me. I declined. I was done with institutions that required performance, that measured worth by visibility, that turned ideas into currency and minds into resources. Instead, I built something smaller, something quieter, something that existed in the space between gestures, in the silence that is not empty but full. I called it the Archive of Reclaimed Voices, a digital repository, free and open, where scholars could submit work that had been stolen, suppressed, erased by the powerful. Each submission was dated, verified, contextualized. Each submission restored the name of the original thinker to the idea that had been taken from them. The archive grew. It included not just Catherine's victims, but hundreds of others, across disciplines and countries and generations, women and men whose minds had been harvested by those who had the power to claim them. The first entry was mine. My senior thesis, finally published under my name, with a preface that explained what had happened, and a conclusion that stated what I had learned. The last line of the archive's homepage reads, "Performativity is not what we say. It is who has permission to speak." I am Lena. I am 38 years old. I spent 15 years editing technical manuals while my mind was being taught in classrooms where I was not welcome. I spent 15 years believing that ideas were luxuries I could not afford. I spent 15 years performing silence, and then I stopped performing. I started speaking. And I learned that the most powerful performance is not the one that impresses an audience. It is the one that tells the truth, even when the truth costs everything you were taught to want. I am Lena. I am 38 years old, and this is not the end of my story. It is the first day my ideas belong to me. See you in the next story.